Pipi Manuel, Pipi Whareroa.
And that's something we've talked about. And if you're dealing, the Children's Commission advocates for all the 1 million plus children in New Zealand, but at the sharp end, the sad reality that that end is disproportionately, for the reasons that we just talked about, Māori. So we're not talking about just clipping on a different cultural lens for the sake of it, but it's something much more fundamental than that. And any Pākehā working in the field has got to realise there are limitations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we don't have, we can't walk in both cultures because the Māori worldview isn't our worldview. I think we learnt that in the youth court for me. It was a bit painful and confronting at times, but it wasn't until we had a significant group of Māori judges that I began to realise that our approach, unconscious as it was effectively predicated on the assumption that the system will work equally well for Pākehā and Māori, but it palpably was not the case. And Māori were disengaged and disconnected. And in terms of respect for the rule of law, that could only really be developed if we at least adapted the process so it was culturally appropriate. And that meant moving the youth court to the marae, involving elders, making genuine attempts to not just have cultural add-ons, but to make the process qualitatively different. And it meant encouraging young Māori to connect with their culture and to answer, ko waio, who am I? Where am I from? Now, that got buy-in that we had never experienced before. But we weren't doing it so much to get buy-in. We were doing it for one thing, it's the right thing to do. And if we've got a treaty that we've signed and we're partnership together because it's ought to be expected. But it is more effective and there is better buy-in. And the other thing that we learned, and I think we've talked about this with Awhina, is that we quickly realised we're not dealing with an atomised single young person, which can easily be the case in the mainstream youth court concept. We avoid against it, but it's much clearer on a marae that we're dealing with an individual in the context of his or her whānau, hapu, iwi.
Yeah.
Actually, it's what the law said since 1989, but we've been abysmal, frankly, at putting it into practice. And we've stopped, if we've stopped anywhere, we've stopped after the whānau. But legislation always said all our interventions, all our responses, and it's true no matter what the discipline, whether it's law or education or health, it's the same. All our interventions had to involve and empower whānau, hapu, iwi. But we've stopped at the whānau part. So I guess one of the challenges to me and challenges for practitioners is that if we're dealing with children, especially young children, it's got to be in the context of not only whānau, which is challenging enough, but also hapu and iwi. And then there are questions about how do we engage with hapu and iwi, how do we resource hapu and iwi to be engaged. So I think they are exciting challenges, but actually they're challenges that we've failed on miserably in the last 20 years, at least in the youth justice context. But albeit a bit late, we're starting to make some fundamental changes. And look back on the youth court as a formative experience for me. I'm excited to see how things are changing.
Yeah.
But in a way, it needed Māori judges to lead that and challenge us.
Yeah. And there seems to be now enough Māori judges to actually be able to take that journey forward. But it needed the leadership beforehand from people like yourself to actually get that pathway going. And it's certainly a model that's very respected overseas. But I really appreciate what you're saying about getting the hapu and the iwi involved, because with young children particularly where there's a health issue or a justice issue, they often have very young parents. And we're almost at the point where we're dealing with people who have only just come out of being rangatahi. They're probably in their early 20s themselves when we're dealing with these really young children. And the only way we can effectively help both of them perhaps is to get the broader hapu and iwi involved. So I think that's
I mean, Fina will talk a bit about the framework that we're using in this
Yeah.
office to better
That would
approach
be
our
lovely.
monitoring and assessment. But just before we get to that, I defy any human being not to sit as judges do in the youth court when 65% of those coming through the court are Māori, not to subconsciously be influenced by what might be called a deficit approach.
Yeah.
And instead of seeing the potential and the opportunity to see the problem and the disadvantage.
Yeah.
And it's a subtle thing that happens without realisation, and we constantly need to be challenging ourselves about that. And the same as the
Doctors.
same
That's
as
what
issue in the health system.
Yeah, doctors, nurses, yeah.
If we're dealing with children, especially young children, as Pakeha especially, we will come with baggage and assumptions that we may not be aware of, and those self-reinforcing
Yeah.
approaches that are far too often deficit.
Yeah.
Boy, that makes our job doubly hard if we're starting with the deficit and the risks and the problems.
Absolutely. And often they're judging the parents rather than the child when they're applying those deficit models.
Absolutely.
P, 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 P.